We are living in unprecedented times. Constant wars worldwide. Nation against nation. Kingdom against kingdom. They're genetically modifying our food. Increased violence as the heart of man grows cold. Ever-increasingly tyrannical governments around the world. Stay connected. End Time Prophecy News with W. Dean Shook, your connection to the signs of the times.
Now, you have a source for the truth in the news. W. Dean Shook, End Time News. Your connection to the signs of the times.
Well, this is a breaking news update. I'm your host, W. Dean Shook. Thank you so much for being here. And unfortunately, I have to bring you the news the mainstream media will not touch. And of course, I've heard a couple little blurps on some local stations, but the national news and others are avoiding these stories like the plague. I'm going to share them with you now about this breaking Oklahoma City woman who was beheaded. Now, as soon as you say that, you instantly think, well, this was Islam? Well, you would be right. This story reads that the FBI investigation claims an Oklahoma beheading suspect tried to convert co-workers to Islam. This is from Channel 4 News, KFOR in Oklahoma. In Moore, Oklahoma, officials with Moore Police Department say the FBI is now involved in the investigation related to a brutal attack of workers at a food distribution plant. Sergeant Jeremy Lewis says the alleged suspect, 30-year-old Alton Nolan, had just been fired when he drove to the front of his business, hit a vehicle, and walked inside. He walked into the front office area, where he met 54-year-old Colleen Hufford and began attacking her with a knife. Sergeant Lewis confirms the type of knife used in the attack is the same kind used in the plant. Lewis confirms that Hufford was stabbed several times and that Nolan severed her head. At that point, Lewis claims Nolan met 43-year-old Tracy Johnson and began attacking her with the same knife. Officials say at that point, Mark Vaughn, an Oklahoma City Reserve deputy and former CEO of the business, shot him as he was actively stabbing Johnson. He's obviously our hero in this situation, Sergeant Lewis said, referring to Vaughn. It could have gotten a lot worse. Authorities say it appears Nolan was attacking employees at random. Here's a clip of that report.
So let's talk about beheadings, shall we? They're the MO of ISIS militants, not the kind of crime you'd expect to hear in a small town outside Oklahoma City. But now the FBI is investigating after a woman was beheaded while working at a food distribution warehouse. And now we are learning that this ISIS style of killing may not be a coincidence. We want to go to CNN's Martin Savage. He is following it all for us. So, Martin, we're hearing that the FBI may be called in to investigate claims that he was trying to convert people to Islam. Obviously, there is a fear of copycat killings by ISIS supporters right here. What can you tell us about that?
Well, as you point out, ISIS itself has put out a call to people who may be sympathetic to their cause in these nations that have now joined the coalition to destroy ISIS to launch attacks. So could this be something like that? There's no doubt that there is that concern, and there are some red flags, as you point out. Yesterday, this was first reported as a workplace dispute. It was a man who had been fired, and it looked at that time like possibly this person had sought revenge by, unfortunately, attacking people where he worked. However, today we learned that that the first person he attacked was a woman. He not only stabbed her, but beheaded her. And as you point out, these days, anytime you hear that word, you think automatically of terror. Then on top of that, according to authorities, this same person who is now identified as Alton Nolan, 30 years old, is the suspect, that he tried to convert fellow employees at that plant before he was fired to becoming a member of the Islamic faith. So add those things together and people are starting to say, wait a minute here, maybe this was something inspired, or maybe in some way he was sympathetic to the terrorist causes. That's why the local police have called in the FBI. The FBI now would be looking at this man's social footprint on social media, in other words, trying to find out, what websites or with whom was he communicating. Was he actually getting orders from somewhere, or was he merely finding these videos that are readily available out there and finding that he liked what he was hearing from ISIS? We don't know. It's still being investigated. But in the heartland of America, it is sending shockwaves across the rest of the country.
I have to ask you, in the beginning, when the beheadings started, we heard about all the ISIS recruits that were possibly coming from the United States, there were certain things in their background, maybe the regions in the world where they originally or they had ties to. Is there anything in this man's background that would lend to this sort of activity?
From what we are hearing, and I got to warn you, this has only just begun, the investigation literally today, so it's going to take some days. But it seems that at least on the federal level, they are looking at this as if it's possibly a lone wolf. In other words, someone inspired by ISIS, but not necessarily a card-carrying member, not necessarily somebody who was flown to the United States or directed to come here to carry out an assault. It's really way too early. They are just starting to follow the threads, Don.
And here's another story from Breitbart News that Alton Nolan's Facebook page depicted beheadings a month before the release from probation. Alton Nolan, the man authorities believe is responsible for a brutal beheading in Moore, Oklahoma Thursday, posted an image which seemed to justify beheading on his Facebook page earlier in this year. Nolan posted on Facebook under the name Joachim Yasharel. Over the past year, most of his posts dealt with Islam. He writes short statements which are signed off with the phrase, "Info from a Muslim." On March 7th, Nolan added an image to his timeline which shows a partially decapitated man with someone standing over him, pulling his head back to show the wound. Above the image, there's a quote which reads, "Thus do we find the clear precedent that explains the particulars of Islam terrorists to behead their victims. It's merely another precedent bestowed by their prophet." Just below the image, in a citation from the Quran, it says, "I will instill terror into the hearts of unbelievers, smite ye above thy necks, and smite all their fingertips off of them." That's from the Quran. The image is actually taken from a 2008 PowerPoint presentation. The PowerPoint, titled "The Perfect Man," is intended to present a stark and gruesome contrast between Muhammad and Jesus and a number of issues. With the creator of the PowerPoint clearly favoring the latter, this slide just shows one of several which feature severed heads. The same day Nolan added the beheading photo, he posted a photo to his timeline which shows a black and white sign that reads, "Islam will dominate the world. Freedom can go to hell." You'll find that full story on the webpage at wdeanshook.com. So how is the news reporting this? They're reporting it as workplace violence. Nolan became angry. After being fired, the Moore Police Department said in a statement released today, sources tell ABC News that Nolan may be mentally ill. Law enforcement officials have not discovered any evidence to suggest that the beheading has a connection to radicals overseas and have made no ties to terrorism. The officials said they believe the workplace anger was the main source of his rage. Now remember what they said here. After conducting interviews with Nolan's co-workers, information was obtained that recently started trying to convert several employees to the Muslim religion. This was a police statement. So ABC is reporting that ABC News consultant and former senior FBI agent Brad Garrett, who has extensive experience in criminal profiling, said that on the surface the incident appears to be workplace violence, playing down the fact that he's a Muslim and tried to convert his co-workers. Well, you know, we live in a dangerous world, and this really raises the question, what would have happened if this food plant didn't have a weapon in there and someone who was trained to use it? How far would this guy have gone stabbing and beheading employees with no one there to stop him? Just something to think about there. And more proof that we live in a dangerous world. According to Breitbart News, Mexican cartel beats a Texan to death after kidnapping and torturing him. Houston, Texas, an American citizen was beaten to death by drug cartel members while another barely managed to survive the kidnapping and torture just south of the Texas border. The two men have been identified as 38-year-old Eric Condoza and 25-year-old Carlos Moreno, who are from the border city of Brownsville and were in the business of selling used cars, according to Cameron County Sheriff Omar Lucio. On Wednesday night, the Sheriff's Department arrived at the Los Indios International Bridge, where the two men had arrived. Fendozia had already died, and Vailer was rushed to a local hospital where investigators were able to interview him. The two men had crossed into Mexico a vehicle they were going to sell through the Progreso International Bridge and were driving towards the border city of Matamoros when their car overheated, Lucio said. They pulled over to the side of the road, and that's when two vehicles with 6 or 7 men carrying various firearms kidnapped them, the sheriff said. They took them to a wooded area and away from any residents and began to beat them. Vela told the investigators that Mendoza took the worst of the beating since the gunman appeared to have been targeting him over a feud with a relative. Lucio told Breitbart, Texas, after the beating, the gunman took the two men to a local hospital from where they were able to get transport to an international bridge. Sheriff investigators are working with U.S. Consulate office in Matamoros to gather more information on the case. Sadly enough, the security threat continues in Mexico. That's why I tell the public, if you don't have to go over there, don't go, Lucio said. And if you do have to go in the daytime and be very careful. I sure hope things calm down eventually. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't seem that things are going to calm down. Like I've said in a previous update, this is going somewhere. So who allows guns in their store and who doesn't? Who allows guns in their businesses and who doesn't? According to the New England Gun Law Group, last fall the Wall Street Journal published an article where companies stand on guns in their store. It was very interesting to see how different these stores can be, with their customers bringing guns into their stores while shopping. The responses were quite interesting, and I thought it'd be fun and helpful to share some of the snippets from the articles so we can be more aware of how certain establishments view this issue. Chuck E. Cheese. They prohibit firearm possession in all their locations. They also feel that this isn't a political statement, but for the protection of their guests. Because of it being such a family environment, they believe they aren't appropriate. Walmart. They follow local laws in regard to this issue. However, they also add that if a customer or employee feels uncomfortable by the presence of a weapon, the manager can ask them to remove it from the premises. And of course, employees are not allowed to carry firearms. Dunkin' brands, Dunkin' Donuts, Baskin-Robbins, our franchise are required to follow all state, federal, and local laws with regard to firearms. I guess this means it's pretty open to what they want to follow in their area. McDonald's. They also follow state, federal, and local laws. However, for franchise-owned restaurants, these decisions are left up to the franchise owners, but they conclude by saying they expect the franchise to follow federal, state, and local laws. I guess this means it really isn't up to the franchises. And Costco. They simply state they don't believe it's necessary to bring your firearm into the store unless you're an authorized law enforcement officer. That's a nice way of saying they aren't welcome in their stores. This is kind of ironic. The Bank of Oklahoma. Now this is an interesting one because they're a bank. The state is an open carry state, so they don't have a policy restricting open carry in their banks, and they don't plan on changing this, unless the building owner has their own restrictions on firearms. Target. Everybody knows about Target. Their statement simply says they follow state and local laws, but there's a twist here. They have over 1,200 Starbucks cafes in their store, which has a slightly different policy. But their view is the Starbucks policy is a request, not a ban. So they pretty much can do what they want. That's an interesting point of view, because Starbucks at the stores themselves ask the customers no longer bring firearms into our store or outdoor seating area, even in the states that allow open carry, unless they're authorized law enforcement personnel. Basically, you can't bring a firearm into any Starbucks. Well, I wonder about the drive-thru on their property. There's also Neiman Marcus. They follow local laws and guidelines, also of the mall that they're in, but don't allow employees to bring weapons into the store. And of course, Macy's, they don't plan to post signs about firearms anywhere. That's it. So what's your opinion? I'd be interested. Send me an email. Give me your opinion. My email is contact@wdeanshook.com. I'd love to hear your opinion. And if you say it's okay, I'll be more than happy to share your email on the air. Whether it's for or against, all opinions are welcome here. We want to be fair.